What better thing is there to do than learn about your hometown and then discover how a New England community has had links all over the world? In addition to being an avid historian, Jack is an accomplished playwright, an avid kayaker, and a mountaineer. He's a lover of philosophy and poetry and is involved in many community affairs and nonprofits. Jack and his wife Astrid live in the historic Abraham Wheelwright house. This may have been the spark that ignited the popular community event, If This House Could Talk. Please join me in welcoming friend and colleague Jack Santos for an evening of armchair travel.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. Yes, my name is Jack Santos, and like probably many of you, I live here in Newburyport, and I've been doing a fair amount of Newburyport research. I also do a little bit of traveling up until recently when I retired. I traveled all over the world and would come across Newburyport in some of the oddest of places. So I wanted to share some of that with you, give you some ideas for a vacation and vacation spots, and then hear your ideas in terms of places that have a Newburyport connection that we should be visiting. But first, I'd like to thank Susan Edwards and all the staff and volunteers at the Museum of Old Newbury. Just a fantastic treasure trove of Newburyport history at the museum. Thank you for having me and for letting me kind of impart a little bit of knowledge that I've gathered over the years in terms of Newbury's impact and connection in the world. So I'm going to share my screen now. We're going to have questions at the end, so we can then have a good dialogue on potential vacation spots, or you could ask me questions about some of these places that I've pulled out, some of which I've been to, others that I know about that are on my bucket list, but I wanted to share them with you. This is part one. It's the East Coast edition. Yeah, we're going to stay a little closer to home today. And then part two will be in January, again on Zoom, hosted by the Museum of Old Newbury. And that will take us a little further afield. Of course, the question for me has always kind of been, why we're a vacation spot. People come to Newburyport and Plum Island and the greater Newburyport area to go on vacation. So why vacation where we live? Why not plan your vacation about where you live? Make our history work for your vacation. And that's what this talk is all about. We're going to show you connections from Newburyport to other spots that you may want to visit. You may have already been there. You may want to go back. But when you go back or you go there for the first time, there are going to be aspects of it that you can tie to Newburyport and make your visit that much more interesting. So now really is the time to plan, to decide how, because as we all know, COVID has put a kibosh on a lot of vacation plans. This talk, in fact, was thought up and planned for over a year and a half ago, and we're only getting to it now, as like so many other things in our lives. Oh, the places you'll go. I love Dr. Seuss. You know, we need to call this a purposeful vacation. Sure, when you go on vacation, you're going to enjoy time with family and friends and visit new sites. But let's turn a vacation into something where you can learn about Newburyport that makes a connection. The goal of this talk should be to give you some ideas on places and why those places have a Newburyport connection. So where do you start? How do you plan this vacation? Let's just spend a couple of minutes about what's worked for me and what may work for you in terms of planning this purposeful Newburyport linked vacation. Well, it may be a place you already want to go, like Hawaii or Florida, but you'll find something about Newburyport that will make it even more interesting. Or you may have a spot where when you find out about the Newburyport connection, it becomes the deciding factor. Or you may go to some places where the only reason you want to go there is because of that connection to Newburyport. And I've done all three, planned vacations for all three of these reasons. And how can you plan it? Well, when you're thinking about where you want to go, there's a lot of resources. It's easy to reach them now by phone, by email, over the internet, the local historical societies, those local museums, anything on the internet like locations and pictures that you may discover, connections that you already have there, friends, family that may know a little bit or can explore for you to start planning your trip. And let's not forget local tour guides. I've had a lot of success with TripAdvisor online, where tour guides that are people just like you or me that live there that may have a little bit more knowledge. They don't charge a lot. Look them up. Those sometimes are people that give you the most interesting information and have some really cool insight to to that destination, including they may even know about that Newburyport connection. Now, the planning should also entail some work locally here in Newburyport. The library, of course, the archival center. There's so much there. Sharon Spieldetter, the archivist at Newburyport Public Library Archival Center, I'm sure would love to be your travel agent. So go down there. You can start exploring there. And remember, when you use the archival center, don't follow the money, like that famous movie line. Follow the people. It's the people that lived in Newburyport and how they moved or visited other places that you're going to follow to make your vacation interesting. And let's not forget the museums, like the Museum of Old Newbury or the Custom House Museum. They've got a lot of documentation and books. I'll give you an example. I've been exploring the letters from Laura Coombs Hills, and Laura had traveled all over the world. She has detailed descriptions of places she's been, the Louvre, Rome, and I'm just looking forward to going back to those places, taking out her diary and saying, wow, what's changed? What did she do that I can do? That's a way to approach planning your vacation. So enough about that, enough about planning. You're off to great places. Today is your day. Your mountain is waiting. So get on your way. Oh, wait a minute. There's one more thing. Let's not downplay the role of serendipity, that aha moment. And it's happened to me more often than not, where you're walking down the street, whether it's in London or Hong Kong, you look at a plaque or you see something, you say, wait a minute, that's about my hometown. That happens too. And I'll tell you about some places that where that's happened to me. So there's a whole wide world out there. We're going to cover the East Coast in this talk. We'll go a lot broader in the second part of the talk in January. In these times of COVID, it's best to start local. So and take a staycation. So let's get on Interstate 95. Behind the wheel of that car and head to Boston. I don't have to tell you that the traffic is actually pretty darn light when you go to Boston these days. Those traffic jams have kind of disappeared, and for the most part, I'm sure they're still there at times. The Massachusetts Department of Transportation announced that they don't see them coming back anytime soon. But when you do head down 95, and this is the first point of a connection to Newburyport, you're going to go over the Tobin Bridge and through the City Square Tunnel, which is the home of John Winthrop, or at least used to be the home. That park above the City Square Tunnel has plotted out Winthrop's home, the foundation. It's all laid out there. Some great historical plaques. That letter you see on the screen is the deed from Masconomet. You can see his signature here in the lower right-hand corner, to John Winthrop's son, that gave John Winthrop Jr. all of the land, basically from Beverly up to the Merrimack River on the North Shore. Yes, he was technically the first landowner. Now, interestingly enough, note that Boston was established in 1630, and even Newbury, 1635. This deed was in 1638. So you've got to wonder whether the Puritans in those days were beginning to say, you know, we're just moving in here and pushing some people out. We need to kind of legitimize that the fact that we've taken over this land. And in fact, there's at least 2 or 3 or 4 deeds where they tried to do that over and over. So you can see it kind of weighed on their conscience what they were doing to the natives. But that aside, the John Winthrop was technically the first landowner here on the North Shore. He had the deed to prove it. It's online at salemdeeds.com, along with many other Native American deeds. And I encourage you to go take a look at that. But more importantly, on your way down to Boston, stop at City Square Park, get off at that exit, take a walk around. It's absolutely fascinating if you haven't been there. So, and that's your first your first introduction to that Newburyport connection to Boston. But let's focus on people we have in common that are a little bit more recent, like in the 1800s, like Donald Mckay. If you don't know Donald Mckay, you're missing a story of epic proportions for Newburyport. Donald Mckay was a shipbuilder in the mid 1800s. He's famous for building the Flying Cloud that made that run from New York to San Francisco in 89 days, which was a record that stood well into the 20th century. Donald was born in Nova Scotia. Once his people started noticing his shipbuilding skills, he moved to New York City. We hired him away from New York to come up to build ships for us here in Newburyport. In fact, he went into a partnership with William Currier at the Currier and Mckay Shipyard, which is at the foot of Ashland Street, and then with William Pickett, whose shipyard was at Moggridge Point. Do you know where Moggridge Point is? Not many people do. It's there at the end of Merrimack Place off Merrimack Street. And then once he spent some time with Pickett building ships in about 1845, he was hired away from us by Enoch Train to Boston, in East Boston, where he had his own shipyard. He built 125 ships, is known as the father of the clipper ship. In fact, while he was in Newburyport, he lived in a couple of places. Specifically, we theorize, one of them was on Strong Street near where they were building the train about that time. And the other was on Merrimack Street, pretty much at the point that the shipbuilding effort was. We think it may even be this house. I can't guarantee it, but he did live in Newburyport. He was here for about 5 years with his wife, Albina Bull Mckay. And these are 2 possible places where he lived. Now, Albina is a story of herself. She worked with Donald, helped him, probably an unsung hero in the building of clipper ships, really spent a lot of time documenting it and designing it. Donald took all the credit, like men tended to do in those days, but Albina was a significant force in his life. They were also a very kind of taken by Newburyport, I believe, because they became a big part of the social circle. Donald was known for playing his violin. They really liked it here, I'm pretty sure, because we only have, as famous as Donald Mckay was, we only have one monument to him. And that monument is in Oak Hill Burial Ground. Yeah, if you go to Oak Hill, you'll find a monument to Donald Mckay. It's beautiful. It's tall. It's one of the biggest ones in Oak Hill, Burial Ground. Both his first wife Albina, and his second wife Mary Cressy Litchfield are buried there. While going through the main entrance, past the Todd grave on the left, the Wills grave on the right, and take a hard right turn, and you'll find the Donald Mckay grave. Now, it's pretty amazing. Only one memorial in Boston, in Newburyport, to a man who was basically the Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and Henry Ford of his time, responsible for clipper ships. The design of them was very innovative in his design, and made the fastest ones on the planet, put the young United States on the map, and that's all we can give him? Well, Boston wasn't quite that foolish. If you fly into Logan Airport in Boston, one of the first things you'll see is a large banner to Donald Mckay, and talks about his life and times building the Flying Cloud in East Boston. So he's celebrated at Logan Airport. But wait, not just there. Take a drive over to Castle Island and the fort, and walk around the side to the harbor, and you'll see the Donald Mckay Monument. It's a wonderful walk, great place to visit. You can visit the fort as well, but be sure to catch the Donald Mckay Monument, because Boston knew what they had, and this guy was a big deal. But wait, there's more. Donald Mckay lived in East Boston, and there are monuments to him there too, as well. There's a monument in the park, in this East Boston home at Brigham Street Community Park. It's close enough to Logan. You may even want to check these out if you've got an extra hour or two while waiting at Logan Airport. The Donald Mckay House is also in East Boston. It's not open to the public. It's still a private residence, but it's on the National Historic Register. And Jeffreys Point Sailing Center, the Pierce Park Sailing Center, is dedicated to Donald Mckay, with a lot about Donald Mckay there as well. It's a great little walking tour that you can make in East Boston. And good on you, Boston, for recognizing the importance of Donald Mckay and giving him his due. A great way to spend a little time in a staycation in Boston. Mr. Mckay wasn't the only famous Newburyport son that left Newburyport for a big city. Take, for instance, William Lloyd Garrison. I'm not exaggerating when I say that William Lloyd Garrison was probably the single most important force behind the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of the slaves. Yet we hardly ever talk about him in his hometown. His boyhood home over on School Street is still there. This is what it looked like 150 years ago when he was born there and lived there until his teenage years. It should be a museum. This is what it recently looked like after about 100 years of renovations and turning it into a two-family rental property. And just recently, in the last couple of months, it's being converted into a condo project, and it looks like this. And good on you, the builder, to try to recreate, and you're working with the Preservation Trust, recreate what the home looked like back in the early 1800s, with a single center chimney, the front door, and the 9/9 windows. This was William Lloyd Garrison here in Newburyport. But, he moved to Baltimore, was a publisher, printer in Baltimore, and then to Boston during the Civil War. And this is where he lived in Boston. It's on the Emmanuel College campus grounds. It's not technically open to the public, although I am sure if you went to them, they would probably let you in and let you take a look around. It's in a wonderful area of Boston. While you're there, you can visit the Museum of Fine Arts. You can go over to the nearby Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. it's just a great place to spend time in Boston and then get a little bit of Newburyport history under your belt in Boston. It's right near Mission Hill, Roxbury area, just nearby to the south end. So definitely worth a visit and walk around. And while I'm talking about William Lloyd Garrison, let's not forget. Well, you may not know. We've got a lecture coming up with William Lloyd Garrison on December 12th at 7 p.m. It's going to be on Zoom, and we're hoping this is the first of many annual lectures on the anniversary of William Lloyd Garrison's birthday, December 10th. So December 12th, 7 p.m., check the Newburyport Public Library website. It's going to be sponsored by the Daily News, so you'll hear about a lot of it from the Daily News. And it's the annual William Lloyd Garrison lecture. Usually a famous author or person who knows about Garrison that can talk about him or talk about the times that Garrison lived in and slavery, the Civil War, and the Emancipation. December 12th. Don't forget it. Well, Lloyd Garrison, Donald Mckay were really important and favorite and had a big impact and connected us to Boston. Like so many other things, but I think those are pretty big highlights. I want to kind of show you a few things about Boston that shows us that Newburyport connection using a person that I've spent a lot of time research and put a lot of effort into because he owned my home for over 60 years. And that is Abraham Wheelwright. Yeah, Abraham. That's a picture of Abraham. Yes, an actual picture because he was a Revolutionary War soldier. And there's not many pictures of Revolutionary War soldiers since photography wasn't invented until 1839. But Abraham was still alive then. He died in 1850 at the age of 92. And he kept detailed notes of his service in the Revolutionary War, the time he spent at Winter Hill in Boston, as well as digging trenches in Dorchester Heights for the mounting of cannons that Henry Knox had brought from Fort Ticonderoga in the middle of winter, mounted them on Dorchester Heights, aimed them at the British ships for what we know today is evacuation. They were the British threw up their hands and left Boston and said, "Yeah, we've been beaten here." Oh, there's the view from Dorchester Heights, and you can see how the cannons were aimed at the harbor, and it's just a wonderful walk with a lot of historical artifacts in the park. I highly encourage you to go to South Boston, walk around. A walk around South Boston is always a lot of fun, but then go up to Dorchester Heights and check it out. So Abraham Wheelwright and the building of the trenches for the cannons that Knox brought over from Ticonderoga. Now, the Wheelwrights had an impact, and it was not only Abraham, but his line and many Wheelwrights from Newburyport, including his grandson, George William Wheelwright I. Abraham's son, Jeremiah, was lost at sea. George was at a young age. He was in his teens. His mother, they were left destitute without much money. They moved to Boston. His mother ran a boarding home, and George went into the publishing business. Eventually, he too moved to Baltimore, kind of like Lloyd Garrison did, and made some money. Came back to Boston, continued his publishing business, and he built his homes in Boston near Franklin Park. That's one of them right there. In fact, he built 3 homes, one for him, one for his mother, and one for his wife's sister. They're all still there. You can walk around that section called the Glen. It's in Jamaica Plain, just right near Franklin Park. While you're there, go to the Franklin Park Zoo. That's always a treat, especially if you have children or grandchildren. Visit the Franklin Park Zoo, take a walk around the Glen near Franklin Park. Check out George Wheelwright's homes and the grandeur that they lived in. They're not open to the public, but unless you know somebody, you can't get in. into them, and they are multifamily dwellings. They've been converted into apartments, believe it or not. So, but George William Wheelwright had a big impact, but even more, the real impact on Boston by a Newburyporter was through his son, Edmund March Wheelwright. That's a picture of Edmund March with his brother, John Tyler Wheelwright. Edmund March Wheelwright went to Harvard, graduated from Harvard with a degree in architecture. He's known for designing the Lampoon Building in Harvard Square. So take a walk over to Harvard Square and check it out. He's also known for designing the Salt Shaker Bridge, the Longfellow Bridge over the Charles River. They just recently renovated that, so it's beautiful. Definitely worth a visit, worth a walk along the bridge to check it out. He was so prolific, you know. He was our Frank Lloyd Wright. He was Boston's Frank Lloyd Wright. He became the city architect and designed and built many city buildings, schools, municipal buildings, including the City of Boston Fire Headquarters. Yes, you've passed this on Interstate 93. It's as you're going southbound, it's on your right. Certainly should look familiar. Was more recently the Pine Street Inn. Today it's known as Water Tower 2 in the south end. If that design looks familiar, it's because Edwin March Wheelwright, like any good architect or designer, took a lot of ideas from other people. At the same time, this tower was being built in Provincetown. Yes, that's the Pilgrim Tower in Provincetown. Looks pretty similar, doesn't it? Because both of them are based on a tower in Italy, the Torre de Mangia in Siena. So Edmund March Wheelwright took that design and used it for building the Water Tower 2 in the south end. Definitely worth checking out while you're in Boston. Now, you may be thinking, wow, Jack's really stretching it here with all these Wheelwrights and their impact on Boston and how they tied them to Newburyport. No, I'm not. They're all buried in Oak Hill Cemetery. They love Newburyport so much. That is the family plot in Oak Hill. And everybody I talked about here is buried there. So they thought Newburyport was very special for them. And you can visit their cemetery plot in Oak Hill as well. Edmund March Wheelwright was named partially after his grandmother's brother. His grandmother was a Blunt, Elizabeth Blunt. She was a Newburyporter, and so was her brother, Edmund March Blunt. Another person that was in the publishing business. He was a printer. He published the American Coast Pilot out of his publishing, his printing shop at the lower end of State Street. Now, the American Coast Pilot was pretty famous. Nathaniel Bottice, who you may have heard about, there have been lectures at the library about Nathaniel Bottice, who created the New American Practical Navigator in 1802. The first printing of was done by Edmund March Blunt. Yes, so pretty famous. You can see here from those maritime books, an early drawing of Newburyport Harbor and soundings that took place then. Yes, his office was in Lower State Street, approximately where Bank of America Fat Face is today. But believe it or not, he wasn't in the brick buildings because Edmund March Blunt worked and lived on State Street before they built the brick buildings, before the fire of 1811. In fact, he had pretty darn good timing because he moved out of that just before the fire. And when he moved to our next vacation spot, New York City. Yes, New York. Edmund March Blunt moved from Newburyport to New York City. And this is where, remember I talked about serendipity? This is where serendipity comes into play. My son lives in New York City, and in one of my visits with him, he knew I liked history and also liked touring interesting places. He said, let's go down to South Street Seaport and walk around. We can visit some ships. We can go into a museum. We can check out these old brick buildings and cobblestone streets. And as I entered South Street Seaport, I look up on the building, and what do I see? Edmund March Blunt. Yes, Edmund March Blunt moved to South Street Seaport, set up his print shop there. And in fact, not only is there evidence of that there today, if you go to the South Street Seaport Museum, it's actually a recreation of his print shop. So I would highly recommend taking a day trip to New York City, or even spend a little extra time there in a few days and go to South Street Seaport, check out the museum, look in at Edmund March Blunt's print shop. And since you're in New York City, it's probably worth knowing about Reverend Spring. Reverend Gardner Spring, who also was born and grew up in Newburyport. He was the son of Reverend Samuel Spring, who is the pastor at the Congregational Church, then known as the North Church, sometimes known as the Titcomb Street Church. And Reverend Samuel Spring was famous because he was Benedict Arnold's chaplain. Yes, Benedict Arnold, who took 1,100 men from Newburyport, put them on 10 ships, sent them up the Kennebec River to conquer Quebec and make it the 14th colony of the United States. That didn't work, of course. But Spring stuck it through with Arnold on that expedition, and he was famous for it. He was a pastor at our church here in Newburyport. They kept the profession in the family. His son, Gardner, became a pastor, moved down to New York City to just a stone's throw from South Street Seaport, the old brick church on Beekman Street in New York City. And he was there for 61 years. Now, if you try to go look for the old brick church on Beekman Street, you're not going to find it. It's now where the old New York Times building is. So it's probably still worth a visit just to check out the old New York Times building. And the church itself moved uptown to the Upper East Side and is now known today as the Brick Presbyterian Church of the city of New York. Still worth a visit. That's a picture of it there, because Reverend Gardner Spring figures prominently, and they still talk about him like he lived just yesterday. So we've got two people that make strong connections from Newburyport to New York. Worth looking up, worth checking out their impact in New York City. Reverend Gardner Spring and Edmund March Blunt. So now, so far we've talked about two cities that could be a day's trip. New York's a little bit of a stretch. You might want to spend a little extra time there. But let's turn that staycation into a vacation and go a little further down the East Coast. How far down? From Newburyport to Boston to New York to Charleston, South Carolina. Yes, Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston's the city of steeples. And if you visited Charleston, you're going to feel like you're just in a bigger version of Newburyport. Or I'm sure as anybody from Charleston feels, Newburyport is a smaller version of Charleston. Beautiful churches, lots of old buildings, lots of history. And in that history, there is one special connection that Newburyport has to Charleston. We did a lot of trading with them. There was a lot of going back and forth between Charleston and Newburyport by residents. But that special connection was slavery. And that brings us back to William Lloyd Garrison. Now, we don't have any indication that Lloyd Garrison visited Charleston. In fact, if he had, he probably would have been hung. But the connection to Charleston is all about slavery. And if you're down there, you should visit the old Slave Mart Museum or go to the city center, city market, where they auctioned off slaves at this building. You can take a carriage ride, a horse-drawn carriage ride around town. It's very, very cool. But the connection to Charleston goes through these two women, Angelina and Sarah Grimke. They probably haven't visited Newburyport, but they did visit Boston a lot because they were close friends with William Lloyd Garrison. It was basically Garrison, the Grimke sisters, and Frederick Douglass that were the voice of abolition in the mid-1800s. And it was Garrison who kind of outed the Grimke sisters. The Grimke sisters were slave owners in Charleston. They grew up in a slave-owning family. They owned slaves from their teenage years. And then somewhere along the line, probably through reading Garrison's newsletters, that they became anti-slavery and strangers in their own town because they were kicked out, moved to Philadelphia, became Quakers where they lived the rest of their lives. And they wrote a letter to Garrison and said, fight this slavery thing. We're right behind you. And we think that you have to actually stand in the face of persecution. So they were very strong emancipation supporters. They felt slavery, the end of slavery was worth dying for. They told Garrison that. Garrison published their letters. It caused quite a stir. They almost got kicked out of being Quakers because it went against some basic Quaker principles. If you don't know anything about the Grimke sisters, you can go to Charleston and visit their home. This is where they grew up, the Blake Grimke house. It's not open to the public. You can walk around the neighborhood. It's a really nice walk. I've been there. And even more importantly, what I like to do when I go visit a place and try to get a feel for it or find that Newburyport connection is read a book or read more about the history. In this case, the book would be Sue Monk Kidd's The Invention of Wings, which is really written from the point of view of one of the slaves that the Grimke sisters owned. And if you're down in Charleston, you go visit Charleston and you try to find out a little bit more about the history of slavery and that Newburyport connection, take the Grimke sisters tour. Just a fascinating tour. One of the places they visit is this house, the Hayward, Washington house, which is one of the older homes in Charleston. Looks like it would be right at home here in Newburyport. And in the grounds behind it are basically exactly they were when the slaves lived there. So definitely recommend it. The Grimke sisters tour. Learn about Sarah and Angelina Grimke, their connection to William Lloyd Garrison. And visit Charleston, and I guarantee you'll really enjoy it. Now, there's one other connection to Newburyport and Charleston that we'll talk about, and that is this man here, Robert Mills. Anybody recognize that name? Where does that come up? Well, those of you in the know, he's the guy that designed the Newburyport Custom House in 1834 and some of its wonderful features like the cantilevered stairs that go up to the second floor. Robert Mills was, in his time, a pretty famous architect. He was born and grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and there are a lot of homes that he designed down there. In the Carolina Historical Society, which he designed and built in 1827, the old Marine Hospital in 1833. The Marine Hospital, by the way, is now public housing, so unless you know somebody who lives there, you're probably not going to be able to get in. But you can visit the Historical Society and see the cantilevered stairs, which was his trademark, that were built into that building as well. It's a wonderful place to visit, really cool things to see architecturally. But Mills is most famous for this, the Washington Monument. That's not the Washington Monument, you say? Yes, it is. It's the initial design that Robert Mills made. Of course, it was interrupted by the Civil War, so many years, only partially finished, and they never really did this little Parthenon bottom that he had designed. But he's credited for the initial design of the Washington Monument, Robert Mills. Find out more about Robert Mills, read up on him, and head down to Charleston, South Carolina, to discover even more and see buildings that will remind you of the Custom House in Newburyport. Now, I like to say that Newburyport's relationship with the South because of slavery is deep. And what I've discovered is we have a triangle, what I call the Southern Newburyport Triangle. It starts in Charleston, and the second point in the triangle is Savannah, Georgia. Why Savannah, Georgia? It goes back to this man, the Reverend George Whitefield, who's buried under the pulpit at Old South Church. Yes, George Whitefield, when he came to the colonies as a reverend to kind of convert the sinners, he started in Georgia. And it was with Georgia where he established an orphanage, the first orphanage in the country. So the same George Whitefield buried here in Newburyport was in Georgia, started the orphanage, and it actually was the reason why he traveled so much in the colonies to raise money for this orphanage. Founded in 1740, it was called the Bethesda Orphan House and Academy. Today, it's still a school. It's known as the Bethesda Academy. And one of his earliest supporters was Benjamin Franklin. Kind of odd ducks, Benjamin Franklin didn't quite follow George Whitefield's teaching, but they were still close friends and had a lot of conversations. And just recently at Old South, there was a presentation made on that unique friendship that Whitefield and Franklin had. Franklin, incidentally, another person who visited Newburyport. But that aside, George Whitefield is that connection to Savannah, Georgia. Savannah's worth visiting. It's worth checking out the grounds of the Orphan House and Academy. When George Whitefield founded that orphan house or that orphanage, it really was a plantation. And what many people don't know, and has become a little bit of a controversy about George Whitefield's past, is that Georgia was originally founded for the intent of sending prisoners and other undesirables, lower class people, to colonize it from England. That's probably why Whitefield targeted Georgia, because these were the lower depths of the sinners that he felt he had to preach to. When he set up the orphanage, he found he couldn't make the orphanage work without slavery. And Georgia had been one of the first colonies to outlaw slavery. Can you believe it? They outlawed slavery in 1749. And it was Whitefield that helped lead the charge to reinstate slavery in Georgia, so that he could manage his plantation and make some money and support the orphanage. And that was in 1751, the Georgia trustees for the colony of Georgia re-legalized slavery at the behest of Whitefield and many others. He then purchased slaves to run the orphanage. To his credit, he also taught slave children at the orphanage, but it's a kind of a dubious legacy. When Whitefield died, he bequeathed all his slaves to the Countess of Huntington in Georgia. So that's the second leg of our Newburyport Southern Triangle. The third leg is past Atlanta in the northwest corner of the state, Dalton, Georgia. Now, those of you that have been to Dalton, it could be because of one of two things. A, you were in the market for a carpet because they bill themselves as the carpet center of the world. Probably another reason to put this on your bucket list for places to visit, especially if you need a new rug. Or you're a Civil War aficionado, and there's a famous Civil War battlefield just outside the city of Dalton. Either one of those two reasons are good reasons in and of themselves to visit the city of Dalton in Whitfield County, Georgia. But I just give you two clues why they're in my talk. Whitfield County was named after, you guessed it, George Whitfield, except they happen to spell it the way it sounds, interestingly enough. And the city of Dalton, where have we heard that name before? Oh, Tristan Dalton. That sounds vaguely familiar. Tristan Dalton from Newburyport and the Dalton House. Yes, the city of Dalton was named by a descendant of Tristan Dalton after Tristram, who lived in the Dalton House at Newburyport. The Dalton House, of course, built by Michael Dalton, his father, but Tristan spent a significant amount of time there. And the city of Dalton was founded by Edward White, his grandson, and named it after Tristan. Well, just some of the most amazing ways you find connections to Newburyport in the world. The city of Dalton, Whitfield County, Georgia. So let's recap where we've been. You can start with your staycation, just down the road to Boston. Visit the Mckay monuments, the Mckay home in East Boston, the Garrison home down towards Mission Hill, Dorchester Heights, to see where our Newburyporters fought the battle to kick the British out, and then explore all of the impact that the Wheelwright family has had in Boston. While you're down there, visit the Winthrop Homestead in City Square, at just above City Square Tunnel. You can go to the Massachusetts Historical Society. Oh, by the way, also designed by Wheelwright. Museum of Fine Arts, the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, the Massachusetts State Archives. And while you're at Glen Road looking at those Wheelwright homes, Franklin Park Zoo is just a stone's throw away. And then down to New York City for a day trip, or maybe a little bit longer, South Street Seaport, and visit the printing press that Blount brought down from Newburyport. Gardner Springs Church up on the Upper West Side. There's a lot to do in New York. Should be no end to it, but I'd recommend the Skyscraper Museum in Lower Manhattan, as well as, of course, the 9/11 Memorial. Charleston, South Carolina. Take that Grimke Sisters tour. Visit a few churches. Check out Robert Mills architecture, particularly at the Carolina Historical Society. And then, of course, there's the Old Slave Mart Museum, City Market, Charleston's Museum, always a delight, and the Hayward Washington House, and see what it really looked like to own slaves back around 1820. Savannah, Georgia is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from Charleston, where you can visit the Bethesda Orphan House and stop over at the Savannah Historic District or the Georgia Historical Society, and then end with Dalton, Georgia. Get a Civil War site under your belt, or as they call it, the War of Northern Aggression, and then come home with a brand new rug. So that's our first part of our Newburyport travelogue. Just remember, wherever you go with all your heart. We're going to open it up to questions and answers. I'll be glad to answer any questions you have about the locations I've mentioned, and then let's talk about your ideas. Do you have a favorite Newburyport related travel destination?
Thank you, Jack. That was terrific. I think we had no idea there were so many connections between here and Georgia, and can't wait for January and version 2. So now we're going to look at some questions from our attendees, and let me just see. Emily Hoffman says, fascinating. Have always loved Savannah and Charleston. 6 degrees. Thanks, Jack.
Yeah, no, Savannah and Charleston. When you go to Charleston, if you're from Newburyport, and actually, I know there's quite a few Newburyporters that go down there for vacation and the like. It's you're just at home. It's a very similar vibe. A lot of restaurants, a lot of old buildings, a lot of history. And Savannah, I've only breezed through a few times. I'm planning a trip right now to go there this winter, COVID allowing, and I think it's got the same kind of flavor. But definitely, I'm sure there's a lot more. I'm just scratching the surface of connections to Newburyport.
Anybody got a question that they'd like to type in? You make me want to go back to the South Streetport. I haven't been there in years. Savannah, this is from Bob Watts to everybody. Savannah has some connections to Davenports. Came over on the Mayflower. So there's yet another connection.
Well, that's the nice thing about this. Once you start get into the habit of, if you go someplace, you start exploring a connection to our town, then it's like scratching the surface and pulling a thread, and so much more starts coming out. So that's a good tip from Bob. Next time I'm down there, or before I go, I'm gonna explore a little bit more about the Davenports and see what the connection is.
And this is from Judy. How often are you looking for connections to Newburyport versus finding them by accident? Good question.
Oh yeah, that is a good question. It's absolutely amazing. It's got one of those pleasures in life when you just stumble across them and say, "Oh my gosh!" We'll have a couple more of those in the second half of this, a little further afield. Our second half in January is going to include places like London and Hawaii and Oregon. Oh yeah, so I won't tell you all of them, but those are some of the ones we're including. Yeah, but I certainly overwhelmingly you have to. It starts at home. There are connections here that you explore, you find out about at the library, and then you start extending that exploration to those further away places. But I really do like it, like that South Street Seaport. I was like flabbergasted. In fact, I came home saying it can't be the same guy. And just today I was in the library and I'm doing some research through the tax records. And sure enough, 1810, Edmund March Blunt entry is there in the tax records, and it says, "Move to New York City." I go, yes, confirmation once again.
Now, Camille has a question. Which of the Wheelwrights is your house?
Abraham. Actually, Abraham lived in it, and so did George as a child. Because Abraham gave my house to his son Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a sea captain, and he died in a shipwreck off the coast of Maryland, and on I think about 1820. But his son George lived here as well, and that's when they moved to Boston. So those three generations of Wheelwrights were in the house. Abraham also built Brigham Manor nursing home. He only lived there for 6 years. He lost a lot of money during the fire of 1811, so he had to sell that and then come back to Spring Street.
So the granddaddy of them all was John Wheelwright?
Yes, John Wheelwright, who's buried over in Salisbury, was the first Wheelwright to come over from England, and yeah, he's the patriarch for sure.
Yeah. Now we've got a comment here from Bob Watts. I just found Newbury, Vermont, which were early settlers that decided to move up to the Connecticut River Valley and named it after their original home.
That should have made this talk, Bob. You're absolutely right. It's I've been through Newbury, Vermont, and although I kind of suspected, I'm glad to hear that you're confirming that it has something to do with our Newbury.
And we also have a comment from Carol that says there is a statue of William Wheelwright in Valparaiso, Chile.
Okay,
owing to his work in constructing railroads there. Now there's a good one.
Yeah, now you're starting to hint at some of the up and coming attractions, because I'll talk about that in the second half.
And yeah, William Wheelwright is probably the most famous Wheelwright. Yeah, he's they got a statue of him in Valparaiso, and I understand every so often somebody from Valparaiso comes up here and goes to the Museum of Old Newbury.
Absolutely.
Wants to know more. So it works both ways, these purposeful vacations.
Actually, a number of years ago, the museum published a book on William Wheelwright, and we still have copies of it. So if anybody's interested in acquiring one, just let us know.
Yeah, William's buried in Oak Hill as well, although he died in London. And we'll hear more about that in January. Any other questions?
Looks like we're ready to wrap up. But again, I want to thank everybody for attending tonight for this, as I said, informative and fun evening of armchair travel. So thank you to all of our members and friends, and thank you to Jack once again. And we'll see you hopefully next month. We're hoping to schedule a virtual program for December that has to do with Christmas. And then Jack will be back again in January. So good evening.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.